What if the secret to hitting a target from 5 miles up wasn't aiming at it, but aiming more than a mile away? In 1943, that idea sounded insane. Military brains called it heresy. But pilots and navigators who lived above Europe knew accuracy was a cruel myth. The higher you flew, the less the bombs obeyed your intentions. Men in aluminum fortresses were asked to trust a miracle machine and then fly straight into a barrage to use it. This wasn't theory, it was life and death. And that one counterintuitive thought would soon rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. High above occupied Europe, Lieutenant James Howard's B-17 and its crew are a tiny aluminum speck in a vast, hostile sky. Engines howl, the air feels thin and endless. Below, the map narrows to a single blip, a crucial German factory that could choke the enemy's war machine. Every man aboard understands what that dot demands. They fly heavy, steady, and exposed, clinging to a fragile hope that this steel bird will get them in and out alive. Accuracy, though, is anything but guaranteed. From 5 miles up, the world flattens into a tiny photograph and a pinprick on the horizon. Through the bombardier's glass, you don't see the factory's smokestacks or the men inside, only a distant, uncertain smudge. Then wind, turbulence, a half-second wobble in the plane, and precision dissolves into gambling. Instruments designed to promise hits become instruments of chance. A perfect sighting means nothing if the air itself drags your bombs miles sideways. For the crew in the nose, it feels like throwing stones from a cliff. You aim, you let go, and you pray. The promise of accuracy is, in practice, a deadly myth. In Washington, the story is polished. Pickle barrel accuracy. They call it slick charts, confident briefings, handsome photos of bombers lined up like clockwork. It sounds tidy. It sounds winnable. Up in the plains, the language is different. Crews squint through glass and see empty fields where factories should be. They feel every failure in their bones. Promises of precision turn into a cruel joke when bombs fall miles off and men burn in flak-strewn skies. The split between the podium and the cockpit isn't just embarrassment, it's lethal. For the men in the air, accuracy isn't a slogan, it's the difference between coming home and never coming home. The 8th Air Force flew in tight aluminum cloud formations, hundreds of B-17 seconds, shoulder to shoulder, a moving wall of riveted metal. The idea was simple: mass the guns so fighters couldn't pick off stragglers, and mass the bombs to make a single devastating strike. From the ground, it looked terrifyingly precise. For the crews inside, it felt like being packed into a flying fortress. Despite the tight aluminum cloud formations and confident briefings, the truth was brutal. Most bombs missed. In the notorious Schweinfurt raid, whole payloads scattered like shotgun fire, cratering empty fields, while the ball-bearing factories they were meant to kill kept humming, untouched. Crews pored over reconnaissance photos in stunned silence. Hours of fright, flak, and raw courage had yielded nothing but torn earth and a failure that bit back. The idea of surgical, high-altitude bombing curdled into something worse, a promise of precision that was false, costly, and, for the men in the planes, terrifyingly real. The failure wasn't an abstract metric, it was people. Every mission sent 10-man crews into a steel storm, tiny lives jammed into humming aluminum tubes, climbing higher and colder with oxygen masks, sealing their faces, and hope thinning with every mile. They flew not as machines but as brothers, trading jokes and last letters while watching the ground shrink and the sky grow hostile, knowing precision had failed them and survival was a roll of the dice. Men who boarded at dawn never returned at dusk. These were not statistics on a chart. They were fathers, sons, friends, hurled into an iron rain. The sky erupts in black puffs, the telltale bloom of 88mm shells. Each burst becomes an aerial mine, a ring of shrapnel that rips through aluminum like paper. Panels peel away, fuel lines cough, instruments fail, and men are torn from their stations, shredded by metal and smoke, while battered B-17 seconds stagger, list, and fight for the thin air between life and oblivion. By 1943, the odds are terrifying. A bomber crewman has only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving his 25-mission tour. That figure isn't an abstraction, it's a sickening arithmetic of flak bursts, shattered oxygen systems, and fighters hammering home. Squadrons watch friends go up in flames. Parachutes gape open or never open at all. Entire crews vanish between briefings and bar stools. Surviving means luck, reflex, and cold calculation. It means replacing a face at the mess table every week. Men count missions the way civilians count birthdays, and every new tally tilts the room toward dread the human cost of a strategy that isn't working. Morale is in freefall. Men who once flinched at nothing now flinch at everything. Crews count names down the roster like men ticking off coins. Bunks hold empty uniforms, and jokes have gone brittle. Every mission that comes back brings fewer faces, and a deeper, angrier silence letters home, stop promising futures and start mapping funerals. They watch fields and roads cratered by their own bombs, while the factories that matter keep humming on, untouched. The disconnect between victory speeches in Washington and the blood on their hands isn't just frustrating, it feels like betrayal. And so the question gnaws at them: who is sending us to die? It wasn't the men. It wasn't the crew in the cold, rattling aluminum can, trading jokes they didn't mean and prayers they didn't feel. The blame landed on a miracle machine they'd been taught to worship, the Norden bombsight, promised as a mechanical guardian that would turn 5 miles of chaos into a neat, predictable drop. Pilots trusted it with everything: their tactics, their missions, their lives. That trust became a kind of betrayal when the device met real combat and real wind. Calling it a miracle felt like a lie. And whoever built that lie would soon be forced to explain why it failed them so spectacularly. They weren't blaming the men, they blamed the Norden, a 50-pound mechanical computer that the Air Force sold as America's secret weapon. It wasn't a gadget on a shelf. It was the centerpiece of an entire strategy, poured into with money, secrecy, and faith. One of the war's priciest projects, its budget rivaling, astonishingly, the atomic bomb. Men trusted gears and gyros with their lives because leaders promised near-miracle precision. That promise made the device sacred, and that sacredness would shape doctrine, danger, and the paranoid security that followed, for better and for worse. Designed by a Swiss engineer, the Norden looked like a clockwork oracle, a 50-pound mechanical computer of gears and gyroscopes that promised to turn chaos into certainty. Spinning gyros stabilized a sighting platform, while precision gears and linkages translated airspeed, altitude, and the invisible shove of the wind into a running calculation, nudging the aim point and timing the release as if a flawless mathematician sat at the bombardier's knee. For crews, it was the promise of control at impossible heights, a device that could, in theory, guide a bomb unerringly onto its target, and a promise people would come to protect with near-religious zeal. Security around the Norden was paranoid, more like a religious ritual than routine military security. Men signed oaths, not just paperwork. Solemn, whispered promises to guard that 50-pound mechanical brain with everything they had. It lived in padded crates and locked vaults. Only a handful ever touched its gears, and those who did treated it like a holy relic. The sight was billed as America's secret weapon, and crews believed secrecy could save lives or doom cities. That belief pressed on every bombardier. Protect the Norden at all costs, even with your life, because letting it fall into enemy hands was unthinkable. If a B-17 was going down, the first order was simple and brutal. Destroy the Norden. A thermite grenade, tiny, merciless, was the last line of defense against the thought that the device might fall into enemy hands. Bombardiers practiced the motion in brief, grim drills, unclip, lift, strike. Sometimes the grenade burned quietly in a metal box. Sometimes men lunged to smash the sight free as shrapnel and flame tore through the cockpit. They were taught to choose secrecy over survival, and a few paid that price. Men who died trying to keep a secret the war had already paradoxically made public. And here's the crushing irony. After all the oaths, the thermite grenades, the ritual of smashing the device, if your plane went down, things, men literally died trying to do the thing they were sworn to protect, had quietly been in enemy hands for years. American crews were taught to treat the Norden like a national treasure, to guard it with their lives. Washington wrapped it in paranoia and secrecy. Meanwhile, German intelligence had obtained the Norden schematics in 1938, which meant the sacrifices and the secrecy were protecting a secret the other side had long ago decoded. German intelligence didn't believe a polished, 60-pound mechanical brain could survive the messy reality of combat. They thought the Norden was a laboratory miracle, beautiful on paper, brittle in a storm. And they were right. Nothing in a test range prepared the engineers for screaming fighters, sudden cloud banks, the staccato of flak, crews twisting and diving to stay alive, instruments rattled by shock and fear. The neat math the bombsight relied on assumed a calm, predictable sky. War offered anything but. The result was predictable. The Norden's elegant equations unraveled the moment the first shell burst into the formation. On paper, the Norden was the answer. It promised a world of controlled physics, calculate speed, altitude, and wind, dial in the numbers, and the bomb would obediently fall where you aimed. It was elegant, precise, almost clinical. But over Germany, the sky refused to be a math problem. Explosions, black smoke, and fighter attacks turned every approach into violent confusion. The Norden needed long, straight, level runs. It needed predictability. The war gave none. Under choking smoke screens, torn-up air, and shifting winds, the bombsight's neat equations unraveled. Its mechanical certainty collided with combat's chaos, and men paid the price. Then the Germans did something simple and brutal. They lit the sky. Smoke generators on the ground belched thick, roiling clouds that crawled up and swallowed the target. In seconds, the factory vanished beneath a black ceiling. For the bombardier, the Norden sight, the one thing the crew trusted above all, was gone at the exact instant it mattered most. But the real killer was the Norden's fatal design flaw. It only worked if the bomber flew a long, straight, level run into the target. The sight was a mechanical oracle that needed a calm, steady platform, no turns, no dips, no last-second evasions, so the bombardier could lock the solution and release. That meant pilots were ordered to hold course even when flak stitched the sky and enemy fighters closed. In practice, the bombsight rewarded predictability and punished survival. To get the promised accuracy, crews had to fly like torpedoes, steady and exposed, while the world around them erupted. The problem was brutal and immediate. The Norden demanded long, straight, level runs, which turned entire formations into perfect, slow-moving targets for German anti-aircraft gunners. From the ground, flak and tracers stitched the sky. Every steady approach painted a bullseye. It left crews with a terrifying choice: hold course for accuracy or break formation to live. They were trapped between two brutal certainties. Fly straight for the Norden, and you gave German gunners an irresistible, slow-moving bullseye. Your plane would slice through flak like tissue, and your crew would be left repairing holes that weren't meant to be repaired. Break formation, twist and dive, try to live, and the bombs would kiss open fields a mile from the factory you swore to destroy. Each run became a lightning-fast moral calculus. A bombardier's steady hand could buy a victory at the cost of lives, while an evasive turn bought life at the cost of the war's goals. There was no comfortable middle ground, safety or accuracy. They could not have both. Doctrine had turned a math problem into a moral one. To put a bomb on target, you had to fly a long, slow, perfectly straight run, hands off the stick, trusting a delicate mechanical brain to do its job. But that straight, obedient plane was also the perfect dinner bell for German gunners and fighters. Crews watched buddies shredded in the sky and asked themselves whether precision was worth the price of their lives. It felt like being written off as expendable, trained to hit a mark, not to survive, and that impossible choice would force commanders into desperate remedies. Desperate, Allied commanders took a cold, brutal gamble, pushed the B-17 seconds higher. Crews who'd flown at 18,000 feet were ordered to climb to nearly 5 miles, 27,000 feet. The idea was clear: fly above the effective ceilings of flak and fighters. But higher meant thinner air, brutal cold, and a longer, slower bomb fall that would open the door to a new, invisible enemy. The goal was simple: climb higher. Fly above the deadly ceilings of the biggest flak guns and the patrol altitudes of German fighters. At 27,000 feet, they hoped the 88 seconds would struggle to reach them and interceptors would fight the climb. On paper, it meant fewer bursts, fewer fights. In practice, it traded one danger for another, an unfamiliar, harsher sky. Higher looked like a solution: fly above the guns and fighters, rise to 5 miles, and buy a little distance from death. But in solving one problem, they accidentally created a far worse one. The sky itself turned hostile. Up there, the air thins to nothing. Temperatures bite through leather and bone. Instruments groan, and crews fight fogged goggles and numb fingers just to breathe. Bomb runs that once took seconds stretch into long, precarious minutes. Every errant gust now has time to yank a bomb miles off course. In choosing altitude, they'd traded enemy bullets for an invisible, brutal force they hadn't understood. At 5 miles up, the sky stopped being just empty space. The air was so thin, engines seemed to gasp, and men felt every breath like a fight. The cold crawled through leather and canvas until gloves were useless and mouths went numb. Instruments iced over. Fingers froze on cranks. Visibility winked in and out as clouds and frost stole the world. And the wind, this wasn't any breeze they'd trained for it, shoved and yanked with brutal, sideways force, turning predictable trajectories into chaos. It was a newly discovered atmospheric phenomenon, an invisible, working enemy the crews hadn't known existed. What they didn't know was they'd flown straight into the jet stream, an invisible, high-altitude river of air roaring across the planet at hurricane speeds. Up there, 5 miles up, the air isn't just thin and cold, it's moving sideways with a force no pre-war manual accounted for. The Norden was built for steady skies and predictable breezes, not for a stealthy, howling current that can shift a bomb's path for minutes as it falls. It was a new kind of enemy, unseen, relentless, and utterly indifferent to doctrine. And in seconds, those crosswinds would seize a bomb and fling it miles off course. The jet stream doesn't nudge a falling bomb, it seizes it. At 5 miles up, invisible rivers of air punch sideways against the metal, whipping a bomb into a long, furious glide instead of a clean drop. Because bombs take time to fall, those sideways gusts keep tugging, hourglass after second, until what looked like a precise aim becomes a scatter of wreckage miles away. Pilots watched brass and calculus fail in real time. Neat patterns of geometry undone by raw, moving air, turning a carefully plotted run into a cruel, deadly miss. The Norden was a marvel on paper, gears and gyros calibrated for the gentler, predictable skies where wind behaved like a polite guest. In the wild, 5-mile air above Europe, it was hopeless. The bomb computer could measure speed and altitude, but it couldn't model a furious sideways shove that grabbed a falling bomb and carried it miles away. Pilots trusted that 50-pound miracle to do the unseen math. Crews set their lives on its promise. Instead, the promise broke. Bombs that should have smashed factories vanished into fields. The machine's blind spot turned doctrine into danger, and bombing accuracy collapsed under the invisible river they'd flown into. Suddenly, the math that guided every raid unravels. The Norden can't correct for those savage crosswinds, and every bomb becomes a question mark. Accuracy plummets what was once proud, precision is reduced to scatter and luck. Factories stay standing while farms and towns take the hits. Months of planning, crews' lives, and the entire strategic bombing strategy hang by a thread. America's chief contribution to the air war, surgical, crippling strikes, starts to look like random attrition. Confidence in technology collapses alongside results. Crews fly higher, colder, and wearier. The air war's promise is bleeding away. Desperation is beginning to set in. The vaunted promise of better tools has collapsed into a bitter lesson. Technology isn't a miracle when the world it's supposed to control is violently unpredictable. Crews now climb higher because doctrine says it's safer, and find only thinner air, colder fingers, longer exposure to enemy fire, and fewer hits on the ground. Flights that once felt purposeful now end in hollow frustration. Hours of risk for results that don't matter. Stress gnaws at nerves. Quiet conversations turn to anger. Commanders trade confidence for excuses. Everywhere you look, morale frays and hope curdles. Desperation mounts, and with it, the urgent question. How do you fix a strategy that's failing at its core? Everything was unraveling. Technology had promised salvation and delivered slaughter. Crews huddled in freezing tails of aluminum clouds, flying higher, lonelier, and striking less than ever. Command could pour more money into secret labs, order new tests, and trust engineers to fix a failing doctrine. Or, wild as it sounds, the answer might not come from a lab at all, but from a single frantic moment in the sky. A miscalculation, a desperate improvisation, a fluke born of panic and instinct. Which would win cold, deliberate science, or a one-in-a-million mistake in the heat of battle? That choice would cost lives. It wasn't a new lab or a general's grand plan that fixed the bombing crisis. It was a mistake born in the middle of a firefight. Picture the sky, tracer fire, black puffs of flak, instruments rattling, men shouting over the roar. In that chaos, a navigator misread a wind correction, a tiny human slip against a brutal backdrop of machine-age certainty. Everyone expected miracles from the Norden. Instead, a single imperfect calculation exposed a truth: the brass had missed the wind, could be an ally, not just an enemy. That error didn't end the war, but it pointed the way toward a radical, dangerous solution. The B-17 seconds are under attack, flak everywhere, fighters on their tails, and then a quiet, deadly discovery. The lead navigator messed up a wind correction. At first, it's a whisper over the intercom, then a cold fact: the whole group is off course. closing the target from a wrong angle. There's no time to regroup. Panic and calculation collide. They barrel toward the target from an unexpected quarter, the whole formation angled like a weather vane fighting a gale. Nobody planned this approach. The navigator's error has turned precision into improvisation. An invisible, savage crosswind yanks at the planes, sliding them sideways as if the sky itself were rearranging the map. Every second feels like a coin flip. There's no time to circle back. Turning would break the formation and hand the fighters the kill. Black silhouettes and tracer lines are already streaking in, closing fast. Radios spit urgent warnings. Altimeters and wind at their backs mean nothing now. It's now or never. The lead makes a split-second call to commit to the angled run, and for a suspended second, every man braces, breath held, facing a raw, terrible gamble. Lieutenant Charles Murphy, the lead bombardier, has no luxury of time or theory, only a screaming sky and the hard math in his head. He can feel the wind stealing under the plane, see it in the drift on his drift meter, know if he follows the book those bombs will arc sideways and miss by a mile. Fighters are closing. Circling would mean death. So he does what training never taught him. He improvises, racing a quick, brutal calculation and prepares to act on it. He did the unthinkable, the exact opposite of everything he'd been drilled to do. For years, they'd been taught to stare the target down, to line the Norden crosshairs on iron and concrete and trust the machine. Now, with fighters screaming up their tails and flak blooming like black flowers, Lieutenant Charles Murphy listened to something quieter, a gut feeling and the math rattling in his head. He swung the bomb sight not toward the factory but way upwind, picked an arbitrary speck of sky, and held it there. It was a deliberate miss, a wager against training and survival, a small, terrifying act of faith. He deliberately aimed to miss. It was the ugly reverse of everything he'd been taught. Point the Norden, not at the factory, but at a phantom spot a mile upwind, and trust a savage crosswind to carry the bombs home. There was no time to hesitate. Fighters were closing. The crew hunched, instruments rattled, and Murphy's hands moved with the cold clarity of a man betting his friends' lives on a calculation and a prayer. Then, barely audible, he released the bombs, dropping into the roaring whiteout of wind. Murphy holds the crosshairs, mouth dry. The bomb bay doors roar open, a column of metal and fire slips free, and tumbles into that invisible river, sucked sideways by a gale that feels like an accusation. For a breathless minute, the bombs vanish against gray, swallowed by wind and clouds, leaving the crew staring into empty sky, praying their wild, sideways gamble will pay off. Later, back at base, the photo reconnaissance returns, and men crowd a long table where wet prints are spread like evidence. Technicians peel frames, officers lean in, cigarette ash forgotten, maps crumpling under anxious hands. They flip from frame to frame, each image a question. The only sound is paper, then nothing else. Laughter dies, pens stop. Faces go flat as they trace the dark splotches and blast patterns where the factory should be, counting rails, chimneys, scorch marks with the slow precision of people, calculating lives lost and chances won. For a long, suspended beat, the room falls silent. When the reconnaissance photos arrived, the briefing room folded into a stunned hush. Men leaned in as glossy frames slid across the table, craters grouped like a fingerprint, buildings reduced to precise, ugly geometry. The factory had been swallowed in a single, terrible stencil. The bombs hadn't just hit the target, they'd blanketed it with an uncanny, devastating precision. Old hands who'd grown used to scatter sat frozen, some laughing once and then falling silent, others staring at the floor as if the ground might answer. For the crews, it felt like a miracle. For a long beat, hope flickered. Command would later call it a fluke. At first, High Command shrugged it off. A one-in-a-million fluke. A beautiful anomaly, not a revolution. Photos were rechecked, instruments blamed, the weather logged as unusual, anything to keep doctrine safe. You don't rewrite bomber strategy on a lucky run, the brass argued. It made a good bar tale, they said. A glorious mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Still, the pilots and navigators who'd flown that mission couldn't sleep on the dismissal. Where headquarters heard luck, men in the planes felt a pattern, and that quiet, stubborn unease would push two officers to dig deeper. They don't celebrate. Not yet. Back at the base, Williams and Murphy huddle over grainy photos and flight logs, fingers tracing parachute streams and the exact point of impact, and slowly the impossible starts to make sense. A silence falls equal parts grin and dread, because what they've found isn't luck, it's a pattern. The wind that was stealing their bombs can be made to put them straight where they want. It's a discovery that could stop sending men to die for missed targets. It's also counterintuitive, dangerous, and likely to be met with disbelief. Still, staring at the evidence, they both know this could change everything. They look at the math, then at each other, and the realization lands like a punch. The Norden's fatal flaw, its helplessness in a crosswind, is also the thing that makes precision possible. If the device can't correct for violent sideways drift, that drift becomes predictable. If the drift is predictable, you can aim for the place the wind will carry the bomb, not the target itself. It's counterintuitive, it's terrifying, and it's brilliant. For a second, the air in that cramped bomber feels electric. What had been a death sentence now looks like a lever they can pull to turn chaos into accuracy and to keep men alive. The bombsight failed because it kept trying to beat the wind, a tangle of gears, and math stubbornly insisting on a straight, calm world that simply didn't exist over Europe. Imagine the arrogance of that logic. Fight the invisible river, and you drown in it. Now flip the script. What if, instead of slugging it out with the atmosphere, you set the machine to partner with it? Aim not at the factory, but at a point upwind. Let the jet stream carry your bombs home. It sounds like sacrilege to every textbook, but sometimes the clever move is not to resist the force you can't change, but to put it to work. They crunch the numbers, fingers, and slide rules, moving like a frantic percussion section, wind triangles sketched across the map, timing charts scrawled in the margins, speed and altitude fed into everything that will hold steady long enough to be true. The math is brutal and exact. The sideways shove from the high-altitude wind isn't chaos. It's a vector, and the vector draws an invisible line from a point in the sky straight onto the factory below. As the equations lock into place, the room tilts from disbelief to a kind of stunned, almost giddy clarity. The accidental idea is not luck, it's physics, and it will change how they aim. At 25,000 feet, with a 90-mile-per-hour crosswind, a bomb doesn't just fall, it flies sideways, carried for nearly 1.5 miles during its 60-second descent. Imagine releasing a brick from 5 miles up and watching it sail past the factory it was meant to kill. That's what crews saw again and again. The Norden was brilliant until the sky itself became a conveyor belt. This wasn't a tiny wobble you could shrug off. 60 seconds of freefall under a furious jet stream turned precision into luck, but it also turned chaos into a number you could measure. This isn't random chaos, it's a predictable, quantifiable force. A force you could harness and aim. At 25,000 feet, a 90 ph crosswind doesn't whisper, it drags a bomb 1.5 miles sideways in 60 seconds, every time. Once you stop treating that drift as noise and start treating it like math, everything changes. Measure the wind, plot the vector, pick an offset point upwind, and let physics do the work. Suddenly, the problem isn't dodging the wind, it's calculating it. What looked like weather becomes a tool, and with that simple reframing, accuracy shifts from luck to calculation. Suddenly, the entire logic of bombing is turned on its head. You no longer aim at the target. It sounds insane, aim away to hit a dot, but in those wild, howling miles of sky, the predictable became the only predictable thing. The wind that had been stealing bombs now becomes the instrument you play. You learn to think in miles of drift, not yards of sight. That twist demands more than a new calculation. It demands a new instinct. Crews who had trained to lock onto a factory now had to picture an imaginary point upwind, trust physics over sight, and have the nerve to release while looking somewhere else. Instead of lining the gun sights up on a factory, crews learned to do the math first, measure the wind, predict how it would shove a falling bomb, then pick an imaginary offset point far upwind and aim there. It feels wrong on the surface, deliberately missing your mark, but physics is indifferent to intuition. You trust the numbers, the wind triangles, the bomber's ground speed, and the invisible shove of high-altitude gusts. You release the load and let the atmosphere finish the job. It's a cold, counterintuitive kind of faith. Not in a miracle machine, but in knowing the sky well enough to use its force as a precision tool. They called it offset bombing, and the name barely hinted at how radical it was. Instead of lining up on the factory and trusting the sights, crews were taught to aim a mile away, to pick an invisible point upwind, and let the wind carry the bomb home. It meant unlearning drills engraved into muscle memory. The straight, steady run, the sacred faith in the Norden sight. Navigators had to become meteorologists on the fly. Bombardiers had to trust a calculation, not their eyes. Pilots had to hold a nightmare profile while fighters and flak screamed around them. It was uncomfortable. It was counterintuitive. And it was the only thing that could turn sacrifice into results. It was brilliant, and everyone hated it. The idea that crews should stop staring at the target and instead aim a mile away sounded like heresy to men who'd built careers on precision and procedure. Generals sniffed at a lucky mistake. Bombardier schools scoffed. Manuals didn't have a chapter for aiming wrong on purpose. Worse, the new method demanded tedious math under fire and accepted a kind of poetic uncertainty that scared logistics officers more than flak ever could. So, despite the evidence, the proposal bumped against a wall of rigid doctrine, professional pride, and bureaucratic inertia until someone with clout decided to take a gamble. In early 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, the pragmatic new commander of the 8th Air Force, sees the potential and stakes his reputation on it. He's no ivory tower general, he's a pilot who trusts results over dogma. So when the lucky mission report lands on his desk, he does the unthinkable. He orders offset bombing adopted as doctrine. That single decision means rewriting training, fighting skeptical brass, and convincing 12,000 airmen to unlearn everything they'd been taught. It's a political and operational gamble. If it fails, it won't just cost planes and men, it could cost Doolittle his career and the momentum of the whole air campaign. Doolittle didn't flirt with half measures, he saw the math and placed a bet with the war on his shoulders. He picked one of his best officers and handed him an impossible order: retrain every single one of the 12,000 airmen based in England on this counterintuitive sideways aim technique. No academy, no pause in combat. Thousands of crews, new calculations, new instincts, all to be relearned in the middle of a shooting war. It was bold, it was raw, and it would either save lives and reputations or break them. 6 weeks to teach 12,000 men a whole new way of thinking, while the war didn't pause for lessons. Bombers still took off every dawn. Crews still flew into flak and fighters, learning on the job with lives on the line. Classrooms would have to run around the clock. Navigators would be asked to rewire instincts they'd been drilled into for years. Trainers would race the calendar and the casualty lists. One slip, one slow class, one confused bombardier, and more raids would keep missing, more crews would keep dying. The pressure was brutal, and for a long moment, it felt like a gamble the Air Force might lose. A frantic race against time kicks off. Classrooms hum around the clock, lights burning through the English night as navigators cram themselves with a new language of wind triangles, slide rules, and offset aim points. Instructors bark corrections. Chalk screams across blackboards. Men who survived that one improbable raid pace the rows, replaying the mistake that became doctrine, while green crews argue, doubt, and then listen. Sheets of calculations are folded into flight pockets. Hand-drawn plots become life or death. All the while, combat missions keep launching, no pause, no mercy, so training must be surgical, relentless, and quick enough to turn theory into survival. Outside, practice flights skimmed over mock targets in the English countryside. Veteran crews who'd seen the mistake led the sorties, demonstrating offset aim points and barking corrections through crackling intercoms. Rookies stared at instruments and horizon alike, recalculating wind triangles on the fly. Skepticism softened into curiosity. Errors happened then, were fixed. By dusk, the dry math from classrooms had a heartbeat. Bombsight, wind, and human instinct finally working together. By February 1944, offset bombing was official doctrine, a wild, counterintuitive method stamped into orders and lesson plans overnight. Crews who'd been taught to fly straight now learned to aim sideways. Classrooms ran around the clock. Veteran bombardiers paced the mock targets, coaxing rookies through frantic wind triangle math between combat missions. The change was messy, stubborn, human, and then, almost impossibly, it began to work. Sorties came back with photos that left officers speechless. Where months of raids had produced scatter, strikes suddenly clustered. Commanders who had scoffed now leaned in. By March, the difference wasn't anecdote anymore. It was a campaign-changing fact. The change was seismic. Accuracy didn't just inch forward, it leapt. Overall bombing accuracy improved by about 60%, and the share of bombs landing within 1,000 feet of the aim point jumped from a dismal 11% to 27%. That hard number translates to real consequences. Fewer wasted sorties, fewer useless craters in empty fields, and a real chance of putting an enemy factory out of business in one go instead of grinding it down over months. Skeptics called it luck at first, but the statistics told a different story, and the next missions would be the proof. Suddenly, bombing wasn't scattershot anymore. Factories that once took dozens of costly raids to cripple could now be put out of business in a single, surgically precise mission. Fewer sorties, fewer crewing losses, and a real, measurable return on the blood paid for every mile of sky. It changed strategy almost overnight. Targets that had been decades away from destruction slid within reach, and commanders began to plan with a confidence they hadn't dared before. Numbers don't lie, but numbers alone don't face enemy guns on the sand. The true proof would not come from charts or practice fields. The ultimate test was yet to come: D-Day. To secure the Normandy landings, the Allies had to silence 49 towering German gun batteries carved into the coast fortresses of concrete and steel, aimed like death itself at any landing craft. The 8th Air Force was given one brutal order: hit them all in a 40-minute window before the invasion, in weather so foul the crews couldn't see the ground. They would have to trust instruments, trust radar, and trust a new, counterintuitive technique that aimed into the wind and let physics finish the job. The success or failure of this single mission would decide thousands of lives. It was D-Day, and the 8th Air Force had one job: silence 49 German gun batteries in a razor-thin 40-minute window before the invasion. The weather was vicious low, thick cloud that turned the sky into a white ceiling. Visibility was zero. Timing was everything. Bombers had to thread the needle under pressure from time, weather, and the lives of soldiers waiting below. There could be no second chances. They couldn't see a damn thing. A thick gray ceiling wiped out every landmark, every rooftop, every gun battery. In those cramped cockpits, the only eyes left were handles and blips, radar echoes, and chalked calculations on a bombardier's knee. So they aimed at nothing visible. A mapped, imaginary offset point on the radar screen set the Norden and opened the bomb bay. Then they did the last, terrifying thing, trusted the wind. 40 minutes to silence 49 guns. One wrong gamble and the men hitting the beaches would pay the price. What followed was a dramatic tale of two beaches, proof that this wasn't academic theory, but a life-or-death tool. At Utah, crews trusted radar and the wind, releasing on their offset points through thick cloud. The bombs punched cleanly onto the batteries. German guns went silent, and troops hit the sand with far fewer losses than anyone dared hope. At Omaha, a last-minute hesitation, a 30-second hold to avoid friendly fire, let the same crosswinds carry the strikes harmlessly inland. The guns remained, the defenses held, and the carnage that day made painfully clear. Mastering the wind could save lives. A single doubt could cost them. At Utah Beach, everything converged into a single, terrifying minute. Crews who had trained on chalkboards and mock runs now flew blind under a low ceiling, trusting numbers instead of sight. Bomb bay doors thunked open. The lead bombardier held his breath, found his offset point on the radar, and released, aiming not at the hulking gun emplacements below, but at a ghostly marker upwind. The bombs punched through cloud, then fell into the gale as if guided by an invisible hand. When the reconnaissance photos came back, the pattern was unmistakable. The coastal batteries had been struck with uncanny precision, exactly where the offset promised. Clouds parted, and thunder gave way to an almost impossible quiet. The German guns' deadly, trained silhouettes were mute. Their trenches and casemates offered only smoke and silence. Landing craft disgorged men who met scattered bursts instead of the withering hail everyone had feared. Stretcher bearers, busy all summer, stayed oddly still. For the crews above, the radios hummed with disbelief, then raw, stunned relief. Their risky, counterintuitive method had worked. In one brutal, crucial hour, the logic of the campaign shifted. Lives were saved not by luck, but by a new way of thinking. And for the first time, the men who'd flown into hell could see their sacrifices had meaning. But at Omaha Beach, a different choice was made. A last-minute order to delay bomb release by 30 seconds issued out of a deadly fear of friendly fire. 30 seconds. In the thin, angry air over Normandy, that was all it took. The same crosswinds the crews had learned to use simply carried the bombs too far inland, past the coastal batteries they were meant to silence. German guns were left untouched. Men hit the beach into a storm of fire. The landings turned into slaughter. The horrific casualties that followed were a brutal, immediate lesson. Timing and wind weren't optional. They were the difference between life and death. 30 seconds, an infinitesimal pause high over Omaha. That tiny delay let the gale force crosswinds push bombs miles off course, falling harmlessly inland while German guns on the bluffs remained intact. Men hit the beaches to find sand, not wrecked emplacements. Murderous machine gun nests and artillery opened up with appalling efficiency. Landing craft drifted, troops pinned on the shingle, casualty figures climbing by the minute. For an air force that had just learned to trust the wind, it was a savage, instantaneous rebuke. Precision matters in war. The cost was not abstract statistics but shredded lives, a brutal lesson that the smallest error in timing could mean the difference between victory and slaughter. At Utah, the idea stopped being an experiment and became a fact. Offset bombing worked where nothing else had, under the worst weather and the most desperate timing, and the results were brutal and beautiful in their simplicity. Bombs fell where they were supposed to. Guns went silent. Entire defenses were neutralized in a single pass. The math wasn't polite suggestion anymore. It was a multiplier. The number of missions needed to destroy a target dropped by roughly threefold, which meant fewer men sent back into flak, faster crippling of German industry, and a stunned command that had to admit a risky, counterintuitive gamble had paid off. Offset bombing didn't die with World War II, it was carried forward into the hair-raising logic of the Cold War. The Strategic Air Command took that battlefield mistake and turned it into doctrine. Crews spent endless hours training to compute offsets, to aim not at cities but at empty sky, so that, minutes later, a wind-driven arc would do their work for them. The stakes couldn't have been higher. These weren't factories anymore, but nuclear targets, and the drills were rigorous, almost ritual. It's an odd legacy. A navigation hack born of chaos became a pillar of deterrence, and its lessons would soon be retested in Vietnam and beyond. As airmen fought over Vietnam, the same idea that had saved bomber crews in thunder and ice proved its worth in another brutal climate: the monsoon. Torrential downpours and hurricane-force gusts should have wrecked accuracy, but crews learned to measure, aim off, and let the wind finish the job. Strike packages that once carpet-bombed jungles began to hit roads, bridges, and sanctuaries with a precision that stunned commanders. Lives and sorties were saved. Offset bombing, born from a mistake over Europe, showed it wasn't a historical curiosity, but a practical, adaptable tool, one that would reappear any time weather or wily adversaries tried to steal your aim. Today, with GPS fragile and electronic warfare a real threat, that weird, counterintuitive trick from 1943 is back in the syllabus. Pilots are being retrained to do old-fashioned wind math learning, to pick an offset point with the same kind of cold, ruthless calculation bomber crews once scribbled on kneeboards, so a jet or stealth bomber can release ordnance without ever flying straight at the target. Even the B-2 uses the idea. It locks radar on a distant aim point and lets physics and timing carry the weapon onto the enemy while the aircraft stays hidden. It's proof that a brilliant mistake can become a permanent advantage. From a navigator's error over war-torn Europe came a lesson bigger than any medal or memo. The most powerful force isn't always the one you charge at head-on, it's the one you learn to read and then use. It's the invisible wind that turns failure into precision, chaos into an advantage. That accidental breakthrough cost men everything and saved others, but it also changed how commanders, pilots, and generations of strategists thought about risk, technology, and judgment. Innovation sometimes arrives not from the lab, but from a desperate choice in the moment, the courage to stop aiming straight and to aim sideways instead.